Right, you join me here today at a very wet Barston Lakes. So the reason we're here today is I've got a match coming up, a silverfish final, and I've not been for a little while, and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to have a little practice and show you guys how I go through a practice session and how I work things out in my head ready for the final that's coming up. So we're at Barston Lakes. We're at the time of year where it's cold. I mean, it's like 5 degrees last night, and tactics and baits that we use sort of change as the water's warming up a little bit as we come into spring. So today's about finding out which baits are right and which tactics are going to be right for when I'm going to be fishing my final. So I'm going to run through probably 4 or 5 different tactics. There's a few things in my mind that I want to sort out, particularly whether the fish are responding to worms, because worms is a bait that you sort of don't want to use when it's really cold, but it can be really effective as it warms up a little bit. So that's the key thing I want to find out today, worms. Another thing I want to try today that I've always had in my mind is, because it's sort of dominated by feeder fishing and pole fishing, you never see anyone really fish a waggler. I mean, I used to fish wagglers when we had international rules matches, SIPS rules. We used to fire out balls of ground bait and fish big wagglers over the top, and it was really good. But nobody seems to fish like corn and waggler. You know, we catch on corn, bigger fish during the summer months, especially on this venue. So it's just something I want to try and get out of my head, if you like, and practice sessions are what it's all about, just getting things out of my head, and I can settle on sort of a few tactics. If we don't catch anything on the waggler today, I know that I'm not going to be doing it in a match. And the thing is, in a match situation, you sort of don't have time to try these things. You've only got 5 hours fishing. So I'm going to run through how I'm going to start today and why, and hopefully we figure a few things out. Hopefully we make a few mistakes, because that's how we're going to learn, and hopefully we catch a few fish too. So let's get going. Right, the tackle I've set up today is really simple. I've got my pole set up. I've only set one rig up, really simple, a 414s F1 maggot. Nice slim float, nice and sensitive for silvers. It's got a relatively thick 1.5mm tip because it is a bit choppy and you need a bit of bristle showing to stop it dragging under in the toe. I've got a 6 elastic, really simple. Still cold at the minute, but if it was really good and it started warming up and the fishing got a lot better, then I'd probably switch to a 8 Dura Hollow, the blue one. Just a bit more backbone to it if we just do start hooking into a few bream or whatever. Like I said, I'm only fishing for silverfish because it's a silverfish match, so the tackle wise is sort of relatively delicate. I've got 013 power line, I've just got a bulk, 2 droppers, really simple, 4-inch hook length, and I've got 09 to a 16 or an 18 SFL hook, so lightweight hook. That's it. I'm keeping it really simple. I'm not here to practice what rigs I'm going to use, because that's pretty simple. It's just all about baits and how I'm feeding today. So I'm just kept it really simple, set one rig up. I've got one feeder rod as well, 10-foot SL, really soft because there's a lot of little skimmers in here. like I said before, it's dominated by feeder fishing really at this time of year. So I've got like the pole line, I kept it really simple. I've just clipped up at 20 metres on my sticks, sort of 20 to 30 metres is sort of where you normally fish, so I'm just going to keep it really simple to begin with. One line, I've got a hex mesh smallest cage on there. I can swap and change. It's just free running, really simple, to say a 15-inch hook length to begin with, 09 power line and an SFL hook again. On this rod I'm probably going to be feeding 2 different ways, just to sort of figure out what's going to be best and what's going to be best in my match. So it's all about feeding, no fancy rigs, just sort of seeing how the fish responds. I think that's it. Oh, got me waggler rod. Waggler rod, I've got my 12-foot waggler rod. All I've got there is a 4-gram insert waggler, nice and sensitive. At the minute I've got no shot down the line apart from a swivel. I might need to put maybe a few number 10s in the toe, but at the minute it's quite a shallow lake, so I don't think we need too much shot down the line. Fishing heavy baits like corn. I mentioned we used to fish big wagglers and balls of ground bait over the top, but because that was float only, we couldn't fish a feeder. So the feeder's obviously so much more effective really than a waggler, especially in these conditions. But I just want to get this waggler and corn out of my head so I don't end up wasting time during a match. So that's it, really simple. Bait selection, looking out of the tree. Bait selection, I've got everything with me to just sort of try a few things. I've got pellets. This is what I'm probably going to start on. Just some 2mm Thin Perfect pellets that I've soaked, and I've got some 4mm Pro expanders for the hook. A lot of venues, they respond really quickly to pellets, so I just want to see, or start on that and see how they respond to it. If I get bites straight away, then it's worth doing in my match. If it's not, then I'll fall back onto other baits and maybe start on a different line instead. So I've also got maggots, casters, worms, ground bait. The ground bait I've chosen is original Thatchers and a bit of F1 Dark. It's quite coloured, the water, so I've not worried about using black ground bait. I've just used the original colour. The water's pretty chocolate. We've had a lot of rain recently, so this lake sort of colours up quite well. So I don't have to worry about clear water and using dark ground baits. And that's it really. I'm just going to swap and change. Obviously I want to try different amounts of worms, see how they respond to that. And we'll just have a little play, experiment and see how it goes. So like I said, I'm going to start on the pole line, but I'm also going to feed a feeder line as if it's the start of the match. So let's get going. Okay, like I said, I'm going to start on the pole, but I just want to get an initial small amount of bait on the feeder line. On this line I want to start negatively to see what happens, so I'm just going to put 3 medium, it might be a small hex mesh feeder there, just with virtually neat ground bait, a few maggots. Just leave it alone while I start on the pole, and then I'm going to start negatively on that line once I do start fishing, see how that goes. And then I'm also going to try positive, feeding lots of worms as well, and see what happens then. So I'm going to put 3 feeder fulls just on my 20-metre line to begin with, nice and simple, and then we'll start on the pole line straight away. Empty that out 3 times and then we'll start on the pole. So like I said, I'm going to start on the pole line. I mean, if this was a match today, I probably wouldn't start on the pole, I'd start on the feeder, but today's about learning things, and if I can catch a few fish early on the pole line, then that's worth knowing going into my match. So I'm going to do things a little bit differently again to begin with. I'm going to start on pellets and micros, not something I probably would do in a match this time of year. I would probably start on maggots, well, fish, maggots and ground bait during the match. Maybe expect to catch late on the pole, but I wouldn't expect to catch fish straight away. But today's about proving things right or wrong, and I just want to check that there aren't fish waiting for me on the pole line that I'm missing out on if I was to start on the feeder during the match. So again, different bait selection. That's probably opt for maggots, ground bait, maybe worms on the pole line, but I just want to have a little play with the pellets, see what happens, and see if we can learn anything by doing something a little bit different. Let's see how it goes. So all I've done is put a small amount of micros in the pot, and I'm just fishing an expander over the top. I'm just seeing what happens. Oh, so there's a bite straight away. So I wasn't expecting that, to be honest. Literally seconds before I get a bite, so that's worth noting. And if this was a match, there's definitely fish waiting for me straight away on the pole line. I think because the water's so coloured, there are maybe a few fish closer in, so that's surprised me a little bit. Looks like a decent fish as well. There's just one fish. Let's see if there's any more waiting after it. Nice fish, that one, for Barston. Nice stamp of fish. Look at that one. Lovely fish. Right, so we've had that fish literally within a few seconds of starting fishing, really. Fed some expanders, just a small sort of pinch in a pot, lowered my rigging over the top, and I've had a big skimmer straight away. So it's made me think, well, if I am on a decent peg, it's maybe a line that I start on, but we've carried on fishing for a little bit now, and we've not actually caught another fish. I've had a couple of indications, but after catching that fish so quickly, I'd sort of expect to sort of keep getting a few bites, but it's not really happening. So I'm thinking, unless I'm on a really good peg, it's not gonna be how I start the match, I don't think. So I think now I'm going to switch it up, feed some different bait on the pole, and maybe have a little go on the feeder in a minute, just to see what happens on there. And then we'll come back on the pole line with different bait that I fed and see how that goes. Oh, there's an indication. So it took a little while, but ideally I'd like to be catching a little bit quicker than that, although does seem to be another decent fish. See, in my mind, I'm not sure of myself now. Maybe it is the way to start. I mean, I've had a lot of cold nights. There's a cold wind. It's raining. Maybe the venue's not fishing that well. But we won't really know until we feed our other baits on our other lines, whether it's the right thing to do or not. I mean, 2 big skimmers like that, and it hasn't been that long, but already 2 fish like that is sort of 3 or 4 pound in my net, really. Fish like that aren't really the fish I was expecting to catch. I was expecting to catch fish a lot smaller than that. Looks like a pike's had that. There aren't any pike in here though, but I think I'll have one more little go, and then I'll feed some different bait and see what happens. Right, so I had another quick go on that. I've not had another bite, so I think it's time to switch it up a little bit. What I'm going to do now is going to feed it slightly differently, with different baits completely. I'm going to get my big pot this time, put a bit of a volume of bait in. I'm going to get my little mixing pot. What I'm going to do, grab a handful of trot worm, like so, a little bit of ground bait in there, a few casters, pinch of maggots as well. Just mix it in there. just so there's enough sort of ground bait just to hold it together. And all I'm going to do there is feed a sort of decent ball on the pole line, leave it alone while I fish the feeder, and then when I do come back on the pole, hopefully there's a few fish waiting for me. If there are, then I've got a pretty good picture in my head that they're sort of coming to worms, if you like, which is something I want to sort of find out during this session. So quite a substantial ball like that. I'm just going to feed that on my pole line, leave it alone for a bit, and if there's a few fish when I go back on it, then I'll know that they're sort of responding to worms, if you like. So I'm going to feed this on the same line as I was fishing before, and then I'm going to start on the feeder line nice and negatively. Obviously we've had them 3 feeder fulls at the start, and let's see if there's any fish waiting for us. So there we go. So straight on the feeder rod, and get it. So at the minute I've got a smallest hex mesh feeder on there. I'm just going to start with a couple of maggots on the hook, nice and simple. So I fed a bit of ground bait with a few maggots in it at the start, that was all. 3 feeder fulls. And just by feeding really negatively, it just gives me an idea of how the fish are feeding. If we catch on this straight away, and then when we do put some more bait in later, we can find out how they prefer it, really, how the fish respond. Like I said, it has been really cold, so I'm thinking this sort of negative approach might be better. Excuse the aeroplane going past. Just adjust my rest. I think that was a bite straight away while I was messing around, so that's encouraging. Yeah, there's a few indications there, so might be that we don't need to sort of feed a lot of bait, if you like, but we'll have a little go on this, just feeding small amounts of bait, maybe a tiny little bit of worm, see how it goes, and then we'll try feeding lots of worms, lots of particles, and see how that goes, see if it has an adverse effect or not. I'm also going to keep an eye on my stopwatch as well. It's just sometimes you find there's a pattern in the bites. Maybe you get bites after 3 minutes, maybe it's 90 seconds, maybe it's 6 minutes. So that gives you an idea of how long to leave it in the water in between casts. I mean, there's no point leaving it out there for a quarter of an hour if all your bites are sort of coming after 90 seconds. So it's worth keeping an eye on the sort of time and see how long you do get in between bites. So I'm not going to leave it too long because I think I missed an indication straight away while I was messing around with rod rest. Just going to give it maybe 30 more seconds, and then I'll have another recast. Wind's freezing today, so it might be that the negative approach is better. Right, the heavens have opened again, just as I'm fishing a feeder. I've had an indication and a missed bite, but I've not actually caught anything on this line yet. Like I said, I've just started really negatively to begin with. Just put a few dead maggots in, tiny bit of chopped worm, and I'm surprised I'm not actually getting that many bites, to be fair. And it might be that, you know, the venue is fishing quite hard and maybe the pole line is sort of the way to go, really, but we'll give it a bit longer on this. If it doesn't start working fairly soon, I think I'm going to mix it up again, maybe do sort of similar to what I did on the pole line, maybe move off to the right somewhere and feed it like a volume of bait, maybe a volume of sort of worms, maggots, and just sort of leave it alone and see if fish come over it. and then have a little go on the pole again, see what happened on that line. And then it just gives me a sort of picture of how I need to feed. You know, it might be that you need to sort of stay on a sort of negative approach all day to sort of keep putting fish in the net, or you might need to leave lines alone and feed them and let the fish sort of settle over them. I mean, it is really coloured, the water, so it might be that you need to sort of put a bit of, you know, chot worm, bit of smell in the water, just to sort of make something happen. At the minute we're sort of quite negatively, sort of mainly ground bait, not a lot of feed, and to be fair, there's not a lot happening, but it is bitterly cold. I can hardly feel my hands. So I think if we do have sort of like a cold spell, if you like, the fishing will be a bit harder. There was a silverfish match on the weekend and I think £30 won it, which is a decent weight, but for this place, I mean, I've had sort of £70 weights in the middle of winter before, but sort of £30 is sort of a decent weight, if you like. If you look at the stamp of the fish we've had on the pole line, they've been sort of £1.50, £2, so it doesn't take many of those over the course of 5 hours to sort of build a winning weight when it's only sort of £30. So we'll sit with this a bit longer. If it doesn't work, we'll mix it up a little bit, try and figure something out, try and be a bit more positive with the bait and see if that works. So it's worth mentioning my setup as well. In a minute I've got my rod rest across my knee, but if you weren't getting regular bites, I'd probably get my rear rest and sort of make sure everything's dead still so I can see sort of delicate bites. I'm fishing braid because you're allowed it throughout the winter. SL rod, it's only a sort of 3/4 ounce tip, so really light. Got a bit of toe in the water, so I couldn't quite get away with a 1/2 ounce tip. 3/4 just seems just about right, and it just picks up any indications that I get. It's just about being patient, really. Like I said, it's freezing cold. I'm not expecting loads of bites, but just going to be nice and patient, and hopefully a tip goes around a few times. Okay, so we've had sort of 15 minutes or so on the feeder being really negative, and surprisingly it's not really worked. We've had a few indications. I've lost one fish, but it's not really been as good as I want it to be. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to clip on a slightly bigger feeder. I'm going to put a few more particles out, some worms, maggots, casters, sort of go for like 6 feederfuls, decent feederfuls, and we'll leave it alone and see if that works. Sometimes you've got to feed a line and sort of leave it alone for a bit sometimes, and that's sometimes sort of better than sort of little and often, if you like, just leaving the fish alone and letting them settle. So we'll try that approach and see if that's better, and then we're also, after I've done that and fed some feederfuls, I'm going to go back on the pole line and see if they come over them worms. So that'll be interesting for my match coming up, to see if worms is the way to go. So we'll put this bait out and see what happens. It's worth mentioning as well, I've also unclipped. I was fishing 20 metres, but now I've just clipped up at 30 metres, just sort of slightly further out. As I mentioned, it's bitterly cold, so maybe the fish are further out anyway. So I'm just going to be a bit more positive on this line. Plenty of casters, worms, bit further out, just a bit more positive. Hopefully a few big skimmers settle over that bait that I'm going to leave alone now while I'm fishing a pole. And it just gives me an idea of what's best. If this was a match, I could swap and change in between the pole line and the feeder line. You know, I could catch a couple of fish on the feeder and maybe put a few feederfuls back out again, leave it alone and go back on the pole line, and vice versa. So just by feeding differently, it just gives you an idea of what's going to be best. Okay, so we're going back on the pole line now. Same rig as before, this time a single maggot. I'm not going to feed anything through my cab pot initially. I just want to see if there's anything sitting over that bait that I fed. It's been out there sort of quarter of an hour, 20 minutes or so. Hopefully there's one or two fish sat there. And then if I do start catching, what I can do then is introduce maybe little bits of worms with a bit of ground bait through the cab pot. And I think if we catch like that, that's the way you sort of catch a big weight, I think. If we can feed through a cab pot all the time and get fish coming to the baits. There's a small fish, might be a roach. Not quite the skimmers we're after, but they all count. It's a nice roach actually. Lovely fish. So again, I'm not going to feed straight after that fish. I'm just going to see if there's a few skimmers settling over there. And if there's fish like that over the worms, it might sort of tell me that maybe some of that bait's been eaten, or maybe it's time to feed again. Obviously I've left this line alone for a little while, hoping there's one or two sort of bigger fish there, skimmers. I'm just going to leave it a minute. I'm not going to feed anything. And then like before, I'm going to get myself a pot with some worms, a little bit of ground bait mixed in. We'll try introducing that all the time and see if we get fish coming in the swim all the time. There's also another little trick that I want to try if that doesn't work. I actually fished a qualifier here probably about a month ago and I actually caught on loose feeding maggots. I didn't catch over any ground bait or anything, but it is sort of warmed up a little bit now. But that's sort of a sort of approach I want to fall back on and have a little play with if this doesn't really work. You're actually also allowed bloodworm and joker in this match that we're fishing, but I'm hoping that we can catch enough on other baits that we're not going to need it. It is getting milder, so I'm hoping we're not going to need bloodworm and joker. There we go. There's a better fish. Might be a big roach. See, feeding baits like worms and that, you do catch other species, which is a good thing. It's a skimmer, that one. It's a good sign. So I'm going to see if we keep catching these without feeding anything. And then I'll try through a cab pot, see if that approach works. It might be that we need to sort of feed a volume of bait like I just have and leave it alone, but I've got a feeling the cab pot's going to work quite well. It's also a good sign that what I've just done on the feeder line is probably the right approach, just to feed a bit of volume of bait. More particles, more worms, just get more fish in the peg. I think because it is coloured, you sort of need to be a bit more positive and draw fish into the peg a little bit. Let the fish know the bait's there rather than fish negatively. It's a big lake. Sometimes you just need to be positive and feed a lot of bait. So we go straight over the top again, still not fed anything. Just see what we can catch off of that big volume of bait that's been there a while. Obviously the fish would have cleaned it up a little bit. See if we can keep catching, and then I'll introduce it through a cab pot. There we go. So we're catching pretty quick. They are smaller fish than we caught straight away. I think by the looks of it, the pole line's probably the way to go. Another little skimmer. So I'm glad I sort of practiced really, because at the minute feeder line's not really the way to go, but you never know, you might catch some bigger fish on it later. And I might also try my little waggler and corn, because there are a few sort of 3-4 pound bream that you sometimes catch in here, so might be a little trick to catch them, but conditions aren't really ideal for the waggler, so we might not get away with it. At the minute I'm looking forward to my matches being sort of a pole match, I think, unless conditions are really bad. And I think because it's in a few weeks, I'm sort of expecting it to warm up a little bit for then, and if it does, I think the pole line will only get better. So I think today's about, there's one, trying to figure out what's going to be best on this pole line. But it's amazing the difference between this and the pellet fishing that I was doing this morning. Alright, they were decent fish on the pellets, but I've just gone in now on sort of natural baits and we're getting loads of bites, so that one's a better skimmer. So if we can get bites like that all day and suss out some better skimmers, then that's going to be the way to go. It's a lovely fish at Barston. So I've still not fed anything since that sort of initial feed that I left alone. I'm going to stick with it, see if we can keep catching, and then we'll see what happens when a ball goes in through a cab pot, whether it has an adverse effect or whether we catch even more. So it's quite windy today, so I've got a 414 F1 maggot, nice and slim. I think if it was any windier, I'd look to use a round body float, still with the same sort of tip. But in a minute it's holding in there just nice. I've got 2 back shot above the float, 2 number 8s. Holding it nicely. Blackened off my tip as well because we've got white water in front of us, just so I can see it a bit better. Obviously I'm on a maggot at the minute, but we've obviously fed worms there, so it might be worth trying a worm head later. Sometimes that's a really good bait for them skimmers and roach. Caster might be a good option. I think soft baits like worm head or a maggot's probably the way to go on this line. And because the water's so coloured as well, I think next time I come I'm going to bring some fluoro maggots, because sometimes that can be brilliant in coloured water. You can just pick them out that bit better. So yeah, I've caught those fish straight away, and now I've been talking, I've sort of tailed off a little bit. Been sat there a little while, so I think if I don't catch one pretty soonish, I'm going to mix up that little mix of worms, ground bait. Oh, there's one, small fish though. I think on this next one, because I've caught a small fish, I'm just going to try introducing some feed again and see what happens. So I've got my little pot again, big handful of worms in there, some casters, a few maggots, and then some ground bait. Mix it all together, so it's a nice little stodgy mix, plenty of particles and smell and grub them to have a go at. So there we go, a nice stodgy mix, loads of particles. It's really heavy, so I'm going to feed a ball and it's going to go straight to the bottom. Hopefully they'll come straight over that. So same again, same hook bait, just a maggot on the hook, and then we'll try that little stodgy mix, see what happens. So we go, single maggot on the hook, just going to mould a little ball like that into the cab pot. Hopefully the fish come straight over that. So if we can feed like this is how we can catch a big weight. But I mean, it is still bitterly cold, so it might be that sort of approach where you feed a bit of a volume of bait and leave it alone is possibly better, but we'll try this and see if we catch straight over that bait. Indication straight away, so that's encouraging. Just going to be nice and accurate and lower it over that ball that I've just fed. Now that we've caught a few fish over this line, I'm really confident going into the match of feeding worms as an indication. I'm not going to be afraid to sort of put a decent amount of worm in on my pole line. Sometimes in winter it can sort of be the kiss of death really, too much sort of feed and protein for them. A little lift bite then. So I fed that bait and there's still sort of activity going on, so it's not put them off, which is good. Might need to take a number 13 shot off the float just so I can see the sort of indications and I'm not striking at too many bites and liners. Not expecting to catch fish sort of immediately really, because if we did we'd end up, you know, catching a colossal weight, and it's still, I think £30 is going to be sort of a good weight. So I don't need to catch loads and loads of fish. It's a 5-hour match and we've only been here a little while, and you know, we've already just dropped onto this line and caught loads of fish. So I had a few indications straight away then, and now it's sort of died off a little bit. Not so many liners, so it might be that we have to be a bit more patient with it. Might even be that we have to feed a ball and sort of go past the pole line a little bit. Sometimes you find that sort of when you fed they sort of back off a little bit. They're still in the area, but they might not go straight over that ball of feed that you've just put in. So might be worth getting a dolly butt and going past it. Just trying different spots. There's a bite there, so that's good. Took a little while, but you know, I'm not expecting bites straight away. And I think if we can sort of put a little ball like that in sort of every other fish, or maybe every fish if it's getting good, then that keeps fish in the area, keeps fish in my peg. I think if we continue like that on this line, then we'll have a decent weight. Just going to try a worm head this time, just see if that's any better. Obviously we're feeding worms, the fish are feeding on them, so it makes sense to try it. So I'm just going to hook it through the head, nip it off with my fingernail. You've got a little worm head, sort of the same size as a castor or a maggot. I'm not going to feed this time because we've just fed that little ball. Just going to take it easy to begin with, and then hopefully we get to a situation where we're sort of feeding really regularly and catching a skimmer every put in. But I'm just going to take it easy to begin with. Obviously we've got a waggler line to try as well later on. Not really expecting to catch on it, but that's what today's all about really, just trying things that I wouldn't normally do in a match. And try and learn something. So that fish was on a worm head, looks like a better skimmer. It took quite a while to get a bite, so I think I need to feed sort of a bit more regularly, maybe just through the cab pot. It's a nice chunky skimmer, so it's worth trying different baits. Sometimes worms can pick out bigger fish, so I think this time I'm definitely going to feed a ball through the cab pot. Go back to maggots on the hook. We just feed a nice little ball little nugget like that. Just push it down so it doesn't topple out on the way out. And I think this is probably the way to feed, really. Nice and regularly, keep fishing the peg, but being careful not to feed too much, because it is freezing. Can't feel my hands, but at least we're catching a few fish. I'm being nice and accurate. I've got a telegraph pole on the far bank, making sure my float's right over the top of that feed. I'm finding at the minute the fish are sort of right next to where I'm feeding. Not too much tow, surprisingly. But I think the wind is going to get up later, so might be that later on we catch down the peg a little bit. I'm not sure this rain's doing us any favours, because it is absolutely freezing. But at least the fish are still feeding, getting a few bites. There we go, that didn't take too long. So I think feeding a bit more regularly is probably the way to go. So we're learning from our mistakes. Another nice Barston skimmer. I think that time I'm going to feed again, but sort of just a little fun now. See if we can catch even quicker. See, I've not even changed my maggot that time. When you are catching a lot of fish, it's a really good bait, along with sort of worm head, so you don't have to bait up all the time, you can be straight in and out. There we go, smaller nugget this time, nice and accurately. Hopefully we catch really quick. Not too fussed on the size of fish we catch. Like I said, it's early on in the session, and later on you expect sort of bigger fish to feed. We fed that bait on the sort of feeder line on a longer line. I think going by what's happening on the pole line, we'll probably catch on that line too. So by setting, you know, a feeder and a pole, you sort of learn off of both, and you can translate it if you like. I think you do need to be a bit more positive and put a bit of volume of bait out, particles like worms and stuff, just to sort of create a bit of activity in the peg, let it build up, and then catch a few fish over it. So I'm going to carry on with this line. I'm just going to vary the amount that I feed through the pole pot, see what's best. Carry on with it for a few more chucks, and then we'll go back on the feeder line, maybe even a waggle line, see if we can learn something else. Let's see if we can catch a few more fish on this first. Okay, so we had a brilliant little session there on the pole. I'm really confident in that now, going into the match, that sort of worms and crab potting's the way to go. Obviously I fed some bait on the feeder earlier, been a bit more positive, was a bit further out, so I'm going to try that now, see if that's better than our sort of negative approach that we did early on. And I think while I'm doing this, I'm also going to loose feed some maggots on the pole line, because that's what I caught on my last match. See if we can catch a few fish on that later on, and maybe also try the waggler if we can get away with it, but the wind's making it a bit awkward, so we might not actually be able to get away with that. But it'd be interesting to see if we catch on this feeder line now, because obviously the negative approach wasn't the way to go. So this time I'm going to feed plenty of bait through the feeder, plenty of casters, worms, a few maggots, just be a bit more positive with it. I'm probably going to feed a bit more regularly as well, just trying to make something happen, just like I did on the pole line. Hopefully that translates onto the feeder line as well, because I think with it being so coloured, you just need a bit more smell in the water, worms, just to sort of try and make something happen. So hopefully, now that we've fed a bit of bait on the feeder line, we've left it alone like we did on the pole line, hopefully there's a few fish waiting. So there we go, I've just left that feeder line alone and we've actually started catching a few fish now. That one's on a piece of worm. So it just goes to show a slightly different approach can sometimes make all the difference. All I've done differently there is sort of feed a volume of bait with a bit more worms casters, left it alone to settle, and there's a few fish sat over it now. So same again, I'm just going to hook on a tiny piece of worm, about sort of 2 centimetres long, that piece. And I think because there's so much colour in the water, smelly baits like worms and a bit of ground bait sort of make all the difference really when you're putting worms through. Just keeps fish in the peg, all the sort of oils and juices coming off of it. We've also gone that bit further out as well. I just think that sort of 20 metre line was maybe a bit too close, especially if I was to start a match on the feeder line. I think I'd like to go a bit further, so maybe this 30 metre line is probably a bit better. But at the minute I've got a feeling it's going to be more of a pole match, just not catching quite quick enough to compete with what I was doing on the pole. But it will be interesting to see if I catch on other things. Like I'm going to try that corn line on the waggler, but I'm not expecting to catch on it, and to be fair, the wind's making it a bit too bad at the minute. And I've been loose feeding maggots on the pole line as well. It'll be interesting to see the difference between just loose feeding maggots and what I was doing with the worms earlier, little nuggets of balls. It might be, now that it's getting a bit more milder, that the maggot approach probably isn't the way to go. But I think in my head I'm sort of happy now that I've at least got one main approach that I've got on the pole line that I know is going to work. Be interesting to see what happens now when I switch it up a little bit. So here we go, there's another fish on the feeder line. Different approach from before. Obviously gone further out with more bait, but it's quite obvious to me that the fish I've had on this line have been slightly smaller, and also it's not been anywhere near as prolific as that worm line on the pole. So to me, I think we're on the wrong tactics here. So I've learned a few things on that line. I think I needed to be a bit more positive with it, and maybe it's a case of sort of putting a bit of extra bait out during the match, leaving it alone while I'm fishing a pole line, and if the pole line's getting a little bit iffy, I can always drop onto a feeder line. At the minute I think it's going to be mainly a pole match. So whilst I've been on that line, I've been loose feeding maggots on the pole line. I'm going to try that last off, but first up I'm going to try the waggler line. I'm not really expecting to get a bite on it, but it's just something I want to get out of my head, and that's what practicing is all about really. So I've been loose feeding a bit of corn out there. Probably a bit too windy to be fair, but we'll give it a little go anyway. So I've just got a 4 gram insert waggler. Nice and simple, 16 hook. I'm just hooking a grain of corn on. It'll be interesting when we get a bite on that. I'm not really expecting to, but it's what practice is all about. And then after we've had a little go on this, I'll go back on the maggot line on the pole where I've been loose feeding. We compare that to what I caught on the worm line and see how they compare. And then after that, we get out of this rain and into the warm and get warmed up. But nonetheless, it's been worth coming. We've learned a bit, and that's what it's all about. It's worth coming and having a look before my big match. Right, so we're on the waggler line and we've had a couple bites and we've just connected into a skimmer, so it's quite quite interesting actually. It's totally the wrong conditions for it. It's moving through far too quick, but we're still getting bites from skimmers like that. I think on the right day, in the right conditions, flat calm, it could be a potential tactic that I might actually try, but I think it's not quite good enough on a day like today. It's moving through too much, and I think we're struggling a bit too much with it. It was nice to catch some fish and get some bites on it anyway, but like I said, I've been feeding some maggots on the pole line, so I think that's going to be my final little tactic today. Obviously we're only doing a short session today, so I'm not going to waste too much time doing too many different things, but I just want to get clear in my mind, because obviously I caught on maggots last time I was here. The water's a bit more coloured this time though, so I'm just going to drop on that line that I've been priming with maggots, and I'm going to compare it then to what I caught on my worm line when I was feeding bulls, when I was catching lots of fish. Be interesting now, just dropping in with a maggot on the hook just to see if we get bites. And I think really the water might be a bit too coloured for it, and I think you just want a bit of smell in the water like we achieved with the worms and the ground bait. Maggots on their own might not be quite good enough, but we'll see what happens now. This will be quite interesting. So I'm just going to spray some maggots over the top with my catapult. Keep the feed going in. Might be that we catch smaller fish on this, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. We'll give it a little go, and then we'll end what's been quite a good session really. We've learnt a few things. There's a bite. So that's a smaller fish than what we were catching. Nice little skimmer. Be interesting to see how fast the bites come. Obviously all we're doing is loose feeding, so I mean, if this works, it might be that we can sort of combine the two tactics excuse me, and maybe feed bulls with the cad pot and sort of loose feed over the top, and maybe that's probably the way to go. But at the minute it's just interesting just to see what comes to the loose feed. Obviously today's not all about the sort of winning tactics in a match, it's about trying things and see how the fish react. So we know a few things work already, but it's interesting to see what we catch just loose feeding maggots. And I think in my head I've already got that sort of worm and ground bait approach that I want to fish, but if fish are coming to loose feed as well, it might be worth combining the two. Quite often you find when you're loose feeding as well, you can catch fish on the drop. So I think if this was a match, I'd probably have a lighter rig, maybe a 4x12 with spread out shot. Sometimes you can catch big skimmers just dropping through the water. Roach is quite coloured though, so they're not really going to see much on the way down, if you like, but they might just find them sort of grubbing around on the bottom. And already we've caught that one fish, and it's sort of, I've had to wait a little while now for the next one, so I'm thinking it's not quite as effective as the worms were, but I think loose feeding might just be another sort of method to my armoury, if you like, just to sort of draw a few fish in the peg sometimes. Okay, so we're still catching plenty of fish on the maggot line, but it's clear it's not been anywhere near as good as the worm line I was catching on earlier. Nice skimmer. I think we'll call that the last fish, and I'll get back and try and warm up. It's been a good session, learnt lots, and I've got a clear picture in my mind for my match coming up that all the tactics that I'm going to do. We've made a few mistakes along the way, but that's how we learn. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Preston YouTube channel for more content, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.